Feelings are a liability, just as deadly as her mission. Serving the mafia boss's son is walking the edge of a knife. One misstep, and it's over. The rain did not fall. It assaulted the earth. It was a torrential, relentless deluge that turned the world into a smear of charcoal and bruised indigo. Standing before the wrought-iron gates of Malfoy Manor, Hermione Granger felt the water soak through her coat, a cold, intrusive touch that settled deep in her bones. But the shiver that ran down her spine had nothing to do with the weather. She tightened her grip on the handle of her leather briefcase. Inside were forged credentials, a wand that wasn't hers, and a poison that had no antidote. She was not Hermione Granger, war heroine, brightest witch of her age. Tonight, she was a desperate academic, a woman whose brilliance had been overshadowed by scandal, willing to work for the devil himself if the price was right. That was the lie. The truth was far simpler and infinitely more dangerous. She was the blade the Ministry intended to drive into the heart of the Malfoy syndicate. The gates groaned open, not by mechanics, but by the will of the ancient, sentient magic that saturated the grounds. The path ahead was swallowed by fog. Breathe, she commanded herself, the word lost to the wind. She constructed her mental walls, brick by brick, sliding her fear behind thick, impenetrable occlumency shields. She locked away the Hermione who felt empathy, the Hermione who remembered the screams in this drawing room. All that remained was the archivist, cold, efficient, hired help. The walk to the manor felt like a funeral procession of one. The gravel crunched under her boots, sounding like breaking bones. The manor itself loomed out of the darkness, a skeletal beast of stone and darkened windows, save for a single light burning on the second floor. The eye of the storm. The heavy oak door swung open before she could knock. There was no house elf to greet her, just the cavernous silence of the entrance hall. It smelled of beeswax, old damp stone, and ozone, the scent of raw, unstable magic. "You're late." The voice came from the shadows of the grand staircase, smooth and cool as polished marble. Hermione looked up. Draco Malfoy stood on the landing, looking down at her. Time had not been kind to him. It had chiseled him. The boy she remembered was gone, replaced by a man made of sharp angles and silence. He wore a suit of impeccable black tailoring that cost more than her parents' house, but he wore it with the weary negligence of a man who slept in his clothes. His hair was longer, falling slightly over his forehead, and his face was pale, almost translucent in the dim light. But it was his eyes that stopped her breath. They were dead things, grey, flat, and utterly devoid of the fire that used to fuel their schoolyard rivalry. They were the eyes of a man who had seen everything and felt nothing. "The storm," Hermione said, her voice steady, though her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. The wards were resistant. The wards invite in those with dark intent and repel the virtuous, Malfoy drawled, descending the stairs slowly. One step, two. The sound of his shoes on the stone echoed like a ticking clock. "I wonder what that says about you, Miss Granger." He stopped 3 steps above her, using the height to dominate the space. The air between them grew heavy, charged with a static electricity that made the fine hairs on her arms stand up. "It says, 'I am efficient,'" she replied, lifting her chin. "And that I am here to work, Mr. Malfoy, not to discuss philosophy." a flicker of something. Amusement, irritation, ghosted across his face. "Follow me." He turned and walked away, not waiting to see if she followed. He knew she would. She was the moth. He was the blue flame. She followed him through corridors that whispered. The portraits were empty, the frames watching her with unseen eyes. They entered a study she had never seen before. It was a cathedral of knowledge, walls lined with books from floor to ceiling, but the atmosphere was suffocating. Tables were piled high with artifacts that hummed with curses. A fire crackled in the hearth, but it gave off no heat, only a sickly green light. Malfoy walked behind his massive ebony desk, but didn't sit. He stood with his back to her, looking out the rain-lashed window. "You understand the nature of the position," he said to the glass. "I do. Archiving the family library, cataloguing artifacts, translating ancient runic texts. And discretion," he added, his voice dropping an octave. He turned around. "Absolute silence." He moved towards her then, prowling around the edge of the desk. The space in the room seemed to shrink. Hermione held her ground, clutching her briefcase as a shield. "I am not interested in your business, Mr. Malfoy," she lied. "Only the books. My reputation in the academic world is fractured. I need the galleons. You need an expert. It is a transaction." Draco stopped in front of her. He was close enough that she could smell him. Expensive whiskey, parchment, and rain. He smelled like a storm trapped in a bottle. "Fractured," he repeated, tasting the word. He looked at her, really looked at her, his gaze traveling from her damp hair to her boots, then back to her eyes. It felt like a physical touch, invasive and cold. He was searching for the crack in her armor, the tremor in her hands. She forced herself not to blink. She forced her pulse to slow. "I am a stone," she thought. "I am a wall." "Do you know why my previous archivist left?" Draco asked softly. "I assumed he retired." "He touched something he shouldn't have," Draco said, his voice devoid of threat, which made it terrifying. "His mind is currently trapped in a loop of his worst memory. He screams for 12 hours a day at St. Mungo's." Hermione felt a chill that had nothing to do with the rain. "Is that a warning?" Draco stepped closer. The air was so thin she could barely breathe. He was invading her personal space, testing her boundaries. He raised a hand, and for a split second, she thought he was going to draw his wand. Her muscles coiled, ready to strike. But he merely reached out and brushed a stray raindrop from the shoulder of her coat. The touch was featherlight, yet it burned through the fabric. "It is a promise," he whispered, his eyes locked onto hers. In that moment, the occlumency failed her. She wasn't looking at a target. She was looking at a drowning man. Behind the grey ice, there was exhaustion so deep it looked painful. There was a desperate, clawing loneliness that mirrored her own. For a second, the mask slipped. The silence between them shifted from hostile to something intimate. He wasn't just intimidating her. He was pleading with her to leave, to run, to save herself from him. "Go home, Granger," he murmured, the name slipping out, a relic of a past life. "You don't belong in the dark." "I have nowhere else to go," she whispered back. It was the truest thing she had said all night. The tension pulled taut, a violin string about to snap. They stood inches apart, enemies bound by a history written in blood, now circling each other in the wreckage. Draco stared at her for a heartbeat longer, his expression unreadable. Then the walls slammed back up. The coldness returned, absolute and impenetrable. He stepped back, the loss of his proximity leaving her strangely cold. "Then welcome to hell," he said, turning back to his desk. "You start tonight. The dormitory is in the East Wing. Don't wander, don't ask questions, and if you hear screaming from the cellar, ignore it." He didn't look up as she turned to leave. Hermione walked out of the study, her legs trembling only once the heavy door clicked shut behind her. She leaned against the cold stone wall of the corridor, exhaling a breath she felt she had been holding for an hour. She was in. She was inside the beast's belly. But as she touched the spot on her shoulder where his hand had brushed her coat, a terrifying thought bloomed in the darkness of her mind. He knew. He had to know she was a liar. And yet he had let her stay. The game had begun. But as thunder rattled the window panes, Hermione realized with a sinking dread that she might not be the player. She might be the pawn. And Draco Malfoy, broken, dangerous, beautiful Draco Malfoy, was not just a target. He was the gravity that could pull her apart. She pushed herself off the wall and walked into the shadows of the manor, the sound of the rain drowning out the warning whisper of her own intuition. Run. The library of Malfoy Manor was not a room. It was a graveyard of thoughts. 3 days had passed since Hermione had walked through the rain and into the belly of the beast. 3 days of silence so heavy it felt like water filling her lungs. The room was vast, a cavernous expanse of mahogany and shadow, where the ceiling was lost in gloom and the shelves towered like monoliths. The air here was stagnant, tasting of dry rot, iron, and the metallic tang of dormant curses. Hermione stood atop a rolling ladder, her fingers tracing the spine of a tome bound in what she desperately hoped was dragon hide and not human skin. Her official task was to catalogue the unstable section, a test, she knew, a hazing ritual. Draco Malfoy had given her the keys to the most dangerous room in the house and waited for her to run screaming or die trying. She did neither. She worked. But beneath the facade of the diligent archivist, her mind was a whirlwind of calculation. She wasn't just organizing books, she was hunting. Every spine read, every scroll unfurled was checked for the sigil of the syndicate, for the ledger of souls. Nothing. Just ancient hatred and forbidden spells. "You're trembling." The voice didn't startle her this time. She had learned the sound of his approach, the distinct, rhythmic click of expensive dragon-skin shoes on the parquet floor, always slow, always predatory. Hermione didn't look down immediately. She finished copying the runic title onto her parchment, blowing gently on the ink to dry it. Only then did she descend, rung by rung, until her boots hit the floor. She turned to face him. Draco was leaning against a heavy reading table, watching her. He looked immaculate and exhausted, a contradiction in charcoal wool. The shadows under his eyes were bruises against his pale skin, but his gaze was sharp, dissecting her. "It's cold in here, Mr. Malfoy," she lied smoothly, clutching her clipboard to her chest. The heating charms seemed to expire near the darker artifacts. "Entropy," he murmured, pushing off the table and walking toward her. "Dark magic eats warmth. It eats light. It eats everything eventually." He stopped a few feet away, invading her personal space with that effortless arrogance she was beginning to loathe and notice. He smelled of smoke today and something sharp, like crushed mint. "I have a new assignment for you," he said, his hand sliding into his pocket. He withdrew a small, ornate box. It was made of black glass, pulsing with a faint, sickly red light from within. The air around it shimmered, distorting the view of his hand. Hermione's breath hitched. She recognized it. A pyxis of delirium. A nasty piece of work from the 16th century, designed to drive anyone who opened it into a catatonic state of paranoia. "Catalogue this," he said, holding it out. "I need the exact magical signature and the countercurse required to open it safely. It's been acting up." He was testing her. Again. He wanted to see if she was a fraud. A simple historian would faint. A spy would know exactly what it was. She had to thread the needle, show competence without revealing her aura training. "It looks volatile," she said softly, reaching out. Her fingers brushed his as she took the box. His skin was ice cold. The contact sent a jolt of static up her arm, and for a second neither of them moved. His eyes dropped to where their skin touched, his expression unreadable, before he pulled his hand back as if burned. "Be careful," he said, his voice dropping to a silken warning. "It senses fear." He didn't leave. He walked to a nearby armchair, sat down and crossed his legs, watching her like a spectator at a gladiator match. Hermione placed the box on the table. Her heart drummed a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She could feel his gaze on the back of her neck, a physical weight. "He suspects," she thought. "He is waiting for me to slip." She drew her wand, the borrowed one, unfamiliar and stiff in her hand, and began to weave diagnostic spells. She worked slowly, deliberately, murmuring incantations in Latin, feigning a hesitation she didn't feel. "Misty," a squeaky voice interrupted the heavy silence. A small, elderly house elf had materialized near the table, holding a feather duster. The creature was draped in a filthy tea towel, its large eyes filled with terror as it looked from Hermione to Draco. "Master Draco, Misty is here to dust," Master Lucius ordered. "Get on with it then," Draco said dismissively, waving a hand without looking away from Hermione. Quietly. Hermione's focus wavered. The presence of the elf changed the equation. The pyxis was reacting to the ambient magic in the room. The red pulse inside the glass box quickened, syncing with the elf's frantic movements. "Mr. Malfoy," Hermione said, her voice tight. "The artifact. It's resonating." "Ignore it," Draco drawled. "Focus on the signature." "No, you don't understand. The emotional output of the elf, it's feeding the containment ward." I said, "Ignore it." The elf, Misty, scrubbed a shelf near the table, her trembling hands knocking over a small inkwell. The glass shattered. The sound was a trigger. The pyxis screamed. It wasn't a sound. It was a shockwave. The black glass exploded outward, not in shards, but in a lash of red, vaporous tendrils. They didn't aim for Hermione. They whipped around, seeking the weakest magical source. They lunged for the elf. No! Hermione didn't think. The spy, the archivist, the carefully constructed persona, it all vanished. The aura took over. She didn't cast a shield charm. There was no time. She threw her body across the space between the table and the shelf, diving in front of the cowering elf. The red tendrils of magic struck her back like a whip of boiling water. Hermione cried out, a raw, guttural sound of pain, as she crashed to the floor, shielding the tiny creature with her own body. The magic sizzled against her coat, burning through the fabric, searing her skin. "Protego totalum!" The voice thundered through the room. Draco was there. He hadn't just stood up. He had moved with the speed of a viper. His wand slashed through the air, a violent, complex movement that severed the red tendrils and slammed the dark magic back into the shattered remains of the box. He muttered a binding curse, low and harsh, and the red light was extinguished, crushed under his will. Silence rushed back into the room, deafening in its intensity. Hermione lay on the floor, gasping for air. Her back felt like it was on fire. Beneath her, the elf was shaking so hard she rattled, sobbing into Hermione's shirt. "Misty, are you—" Hermione wheezed, trying to push herself up. "Get out!" Draco's voice was a low growl. He wasn't looking at Hermione. He was looking at the elf. "Go! Now!" Misty vanished with a loud crack, leaving Hermione alone on the floor with the heir of the Malfoy Empire. She gritted her teeth and pushed herself into a sitting position. Her shoulder throbbed viciously. She looked up to find Draco standing over her. He wasn't looking at the box. He was staring at her, his chest heaving slightly, his grey eyes wide, blown with something that looked like shock, or perhaps horror. "You are an idiot," he hissed. He crouched down, not to help her up, but to get on her level. His face was inches from hers. The anger radiating off him was palpable, hot and suffocating. "You threw yourself in front of a Class A dark curse," he said, enunciating every word with biting precision. "For a house elf." "She would have died," Hermione gasped, clutching her shoulder. "She is a servant. You are—" He stopped, the words catching in his throat. He looked at her, searching her face, his eyes darting back and forth. "What are you?" "I'm a human being," she snapped, the pain stripping away her deference. "Something you might have forgotten how to be." The insult hung in the air. For a moment, she thought he would curse her. His eyes narrowed, the grey turning to storm clouds. He reached out, his hand hovering over her injured shoulder. Hermione flinched. Draco froze. He saw the flinch. A flicker of something crossed his face. Shame? Regret? Before he masked it with his usual sneer. "Let me see," he ordered. "I'm fine." "Granger." He used her false name, but the tone was the same one he used in the corridors of Hogwarts. "Do not test my patience. That curse causes necrosis if untreated." He didn't wait for permission. He reached out and gripped the collar of her coat, pulling it aside gently to reveal the blouse underneath. The fabric was singed away, revealing the angry red welt on her skin. Draco stared at the wound. His fingers, usually so steady, trembled slightly as they hovered over the burnt skin. He didn't touch the injury, but the proximity of his hand felt like a balm. "Why?" he whispered. It wasn't a challenge this time. It was a genuine question. He looked into her eyes, and the ice was gone. He looked lost. "Why save something that cannot save you back?" "Because it's the right thing to do," Hermione whispered. Draco laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "The right thing. You'll find that concept has no currency in this house. Mercy gets you killed here." "Then why did you save me?" she asked. The question stopped him. His jaw tightened. He looked at the wound, then back at her eyes. The tension between them shifted. It wasn't the tension of enemies anymore. It was the tension of two people recognizing a terrifying similarity in each other. He had reacted as instinctively as she had. He had protected her. "Because," he said softly, his voice dropping to a rough whisper, "finding a new archivist is a bureaucratic nightmare." He pulled a vial from his inner pocket, a shimmering blue potion, and uncorked it with his thumb. Drink this. It will stop the burning. He handed it to her. Their fingers brushed again. This time, neither pulled away immediately. The contact was an anchor in the spinning room. Hermione took the vial, her eyes never leaving his. She saw the conflict raging behind his occlumency shields, the war between the monster he was raised to be and the man who had just saved her life. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me," he said, standing up abruptly and retreating behind the mask of cold indifference. He turned his back to her, adjusting his cuffs. "Clean this mess up. And Granger?" "Yes?" He looked over his shoulder. The look he gave her was searing, intense, calculating, and dangerously curious. "Next time, let the elf take the hit. I don't pay you to be a martyr." He walked out of the library, the heavy doors booming shut behind him. Hermione sat on the floor, the cooling potion in her hand, her heart racing so fast it made her dizzy. She drank the liquid, feeling the pain recede, but the heat of his gaze lingered. She had passed the test, but she had failed the mission. She was supposed to be invisible. She was supposed to be a grey, forgettable presence. Instead, she had made herself vibrant. She had shown him her fire, and Draco Malfoy, the boy who had once wished her dead, had looked at that fire and hadn't wanted to put it out. She touched the spot on her shoulder where his breath had ghosted against her skin. He's not purely evil, she thought, the realization settling in her stomach like a stone. He's not the monster the file says he is, and that made him infinitely more dangerous. Because it was easy to betray a monster. It was impossible to betray a man who looked at you like you were the only real thing in a world of ghosts. Outside, the storm raged on, but the thunder was quiet compared to the warning bells ringing in her head. She was falling, and there was no one to catch her. The silence of Malfoy Manor was not empty. It was heavy, a living thing that pressed against the eardrums and settled in the lungs like silt. It was 3 a.m, the witching hour when the magic in the ancient stones woke up and the humans were supposed to be asleep. Hermione Granger was wide awake. She lay in the 4-poster bed of the guest quarters, staring at the velvet canopy that looked like a pool of spilled ink in the darkness. Her heart was a steady, rhythmic thud against her ribs, a metronome counting down the seconds of her survival. She threw the covers back. The air in the room was cold, biting at her bare legs as she swung them over the edge of the mattress. She reached for her robe, wrapping it tight around her silk nightgown, tying the sash with a knot that felt like a strangulation. Tonight, the archivist was off duty. Tonight, the spy had work to do. She slipped her wand, her real wand, vinewood concealed within the lining of her sleeve, into her palm. She didn't cast a lumos. Light was an enemy here. She relied on the ambient, ghostly glow of the moon filtering through the high arched windows of the corridor. Opening her door, she stepped out into the hallway. The manor was a labyrinth of shadows. The portraits were sleeping, or pretending to, their snores echoing softly like the distant rumble of the ocean. Hermione moved with the practiced silence of a predator, her weight rolling from heel to toe, making no sound on the plush runner rugs. Her destination was the West Wing, the forbidden territory. According to the intelligence reports briefed by the Auror office, the West Wing housed Lucius Malfoy's private solar, the likely resting place of the Ledger. But the reports failed to mention the oppressive dread that thickened the air the further she walked. It felt as if the house itself was watching her, judging her intrusion. She passed a row of marble busts, their blank eyes seeming to track her movement. Every creak of the floorboards upstairs sounded like a footstep. Every gust of wind against the glass sounded like a whisper. Fear is useful, she told herself, clutching her wand tighter. Fear keeps you sharp. She reached the intersection where the guest wing bled into the family quarters. A massive tapestry depicting a gruesome manticore hunt hung on the wall, the threads shimmering faintly. Hermione paused, her senses screaming. Something was wrong. The air pressure dropped. The faint scent of ozone and expensive fire whiskey drifted on a draft that shouldn't exist. She wasn't alone. Panic, cold and sharp, spiked in her chest. She couldn't be found here. Not this close to the family wing. There was no excuse she could invent that would satisfy the paranoia of the Malfoys. She spun around, intending to retreat to the library to claim insomnia, but a shadow detached itself from the wall directly in front of her. "Going somewhere?" The voice was a low rumble, wrapped in velvet and steel. Hermione gasped, stumbling back a step. Draco Malfoy stood in the center of the corridor, blocking her path. He wasn't wearing his armor of tailored suits. He was in black trousers and a white dress shirt, the top buttons undone, the sleeves rolled up to his elbows. He looked disheveled, dangerous, and devastatingly human. He held a tumbler of amber liquid in one hand, his wand loosely in the other. He didn't raise it. He didn't have to. His presence was weapon enough. I was lost," Hermione stammered, the lie tasting like ash in her mouth. She hated how breathless she sounded. "Lost," Draco repeated, deadpan. He took a slow step toward her. "In your own home for 3 days, and yet you find yourself navigating the one corridor explicitly forbidden to staff. You have a terrible sense of direction, Miss Granger." He was closing the distance. The hallway was wide, but he made it feel like a coffin. "I couldn't sleep," she said, backing away until her shoulder blades hit the rough stone of the wall. There was nowhere left to go. "I was looking for the kitchens, for water. The kitchens are in the basement, 2 floors down, in the opposite direction." He stopped mere inches from her. He was tall, looming over her, blotting out the moonlight. The smell of him, alcohol, rain, and that unique, crisp scent of magic enveloped her. It was intoxicating and terrifying. Draco leaned in, placing his hand on the wall beside her head, effectively boxing her in. The glass in his other hand tilted, the ice clinking softly, a jarring sound in the quiet. "Tell me," he whispered, his face so close she could feel the warmth of his breath on her cheek. "Are you a fool, or do you think I am one?" "I think you're tired, Mr. Malfoy," Hermione said, forcing her voice to remain steady, though her knees felt like water. She looked up, meeting his gaze. His eyes were dark pools, the pupils blown wide. He was occluding, but poorly. The alcohol had chipped away at his shields. Beneath the cold suspicion, she saw a chaotic storm of anger and hunger. "I am beyond tired," he murmured, his gaze dropping to her mouth, then tracing the line of her throat down to where her pulse fluttered wildly at the base of her neck. "I am exhausted by liars, by people who smile to my face and hold daggers behind their backs." "I have no dagger," she whispered. "No," he agreed softly. "You have something worse. You have a mind, and I can hear it working, even now, whirring, calculating, spinning tales." He shifted his weight, pressing closer. His knee brushed against her thigh through the silk of her robe. The contact sent a shockwave through her body that had nothing to do with fear. It was a raw, visceral jolt of attraction that horrified her. She was supposed to be destroying him. She wasn't supposed to wonder what his mouth would taste like. "Let me pass," she said, though the words lacked conviction. "Why?" Draco tilted his head, his nose brushing against her temple. He was inhaling her scent, lavender soap and anxiety. "You wanted to explore the dark, didn't you? You wanted to see what the Malfoys hide in the shadows. Well, here I am." The double meaning hung in the air, heavy and sensual. "You are drunk," Hermione said, trying to push him away. Her hand landed on his chest, directly over his heart. She could feel it beating, slow, heavy thuds. He didn't move. He covered her hand with his own, trapping her fingers against the warmth of his shirt. His skin was burning. "And you are trembling," he countered, his voice a low purr. "Is it fear, Granger, or is it something else?" He moved his face back to look at her, searching her eyes. The moonlight caught the sharp angles of his cheekbones, the pale sweep of his lashes. He was beautiful in a tragic, broken way. "You're dangerous," she breathed. "I am the least dangerous thing in this hallway," he said, his expression hardening suddenly. The seduction vanished, replaced by a cold, sharp warning. He leaned in again, his lips brushing her ear. "My father, if he found you here, wandering near his study, he wouldn't ask you for an excuse. He would flay your mind open just to see the color of your thoughts." Hermione froze. He knew. He knew exactly where she was going. "Draco," she started, the name slipping out unauthorized. He pulled back sharply as if she had slapped him. He released her hand and stepped back, breaking the suffocating intimacy of the moment. He took a long swallow of his drink, his eyes never leaving hers. "Go back to your room," he commanded, his voice rougher now, stripped of the silk. "Lock the door, and do not come out until the sun is up." "Why didn't you turn me in?" Hermione asked, the question tumbling out before she could stop it. "If you think I'm a spy, why am I still breathing?" Draco stared at her for a long moment. The silence stretched, filled with the ghosts of everything they couldn't say. He looked at her, not as a hired employee, not as a muddy-blooded enemy, but as an equal standing on the edge of the same precipice. "Because," he said, turning away from her, his shoulders slumped in a posture of infinite defeat. "I am sick of the blood, and because you are the only person in this house who looks at me and sees a man, not a weapon." He didn't wait for her response. He began to walk away, dissolving back into the shadows of the West Wing. "Draco!" she called out, a whisper in the dark. He paused, half-turned. "The dark eats everything," she said, echoing his words from the library. "Don't let it eat you." He didn't answer. He just vanished around the corner, leaving her alone in the cold corridor. Hermione stood there for a long time, her back pressed against the wall, her hand still tingling where it had touched his heart. Her breath came in ragged gasps. She had gone looking for evidence, for a weapon to destroy the Malfoy clan. Instead, she had found a crack in the armor. She realized with a terrifying clarity that Draco wasn't guarding the West Wing to protect the secrets from her. He was guarding her from the secrets. She turned and ran back to her room, the sound of her bare feet on the stone echoing like a heartbeat. She locked the door and leaned against it, sliding down until she hit the floor. She buried her face in her hands. The mission was compromised, not because he suspected her, but because she was starting to care. And in the game of spies and monsters, caring was the fastest way to die. Outside, the wind howled around the manor, a lonely, mournful sound. But it was nothing compared to the storm that had just begun inside her chest. The line between enemy and lover had not just been blurred, it had been crossed, and there was no going back. The dress lay on the bed like a pool of liquid emeralds. It was silk, scandalously expensive, and terrified Hermione more than any curse she had dismantled in the past week. There was a note resting on the bodice, written in sharp, angular script. Armor up. Tonight, you are not a scholar. You are mine. Hermione stared at the paper, her stomach twisting into a cold, hard knot. The annual solstice gala. The gathering of the syndicate's inner circle. The most dangerous room in Britain, filled with warlords in tuxedos and murderers in pearls. And Draco Malfoy needed a shield. He had come to her an hour ago, his face pale, his jaw set. "The Knot faction is moving against me," he had said, pacing her small room like a caged tiger. "They think I am weak. They think I am unmoored. I need to show them I am building something new. I need a distraction." "And I'm the distraction?" she had asked, incredulous. "You are the statement," he had corrected, stopping to look at her. "A muggle born on the arm of the Malfoy heir. It will confuse them long enough for me to secure the votes. You just have to play the part." "What part?" "The woman who tamed the beast." Now, standing before the mirror, Hermione hardly recognized the woman staring back. The dress fit like a second skin, clinging to her curves, the back plunging dangerously low. Her hair, usually a wild mane, was tamed into sleek, glossy waves that cascaded over one shoulder. She looked dangerous. She looked like she belonged to the dark. A knock at the door, 3 sharp raps. "Enter," she said, her voice sounding foreign to her own ears. The door opened and Draco stepped in. He stopped dead. For a moment the silence stretched, thick and vibrating. Draco was dressed in formal dress robes of midnight blue, the silver buttons gleaming under the candlelight. He looked every inch the aristocracy he despised. But as his eyes swept over her, the mask of bored indifference cracked. His gaze was physical, a tactile weight that travelled from the hem of her gown to the pulse fluttering at her throat. He didn't smile. He looked almost pained. "Adequate," he choked out, his voice rough. Hermione let out a breath she didn't know she was holding. "High praise coming from you." He walked over to her, stopping behind her. He didn't touch her, but she could feel the heat radiating from his body. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a necklace, a delicate silver chain holding a single teardrop-shaped emerald. "Family heirloom?" she asked, trying to keep her tone light to hide the trembling of her hands. "A collar," he murmured, moving to fasten it around her neck. His fingers brushed the sensitive skin at her nape, cold against her warmth. Hermione shivered. "It has a tracking charm and a shield charm. If anyone casts anything stronger than a stinging jinx at you, it will reflect the spell back with double the force." "You expect trouble." "I expect sharks," he whispered, his hands lingering on her shoulders for a fraction of a second too long. He leaned in, his breath stirring the hair near her ear. "Listen to me, Granger. Tonight, you do not speak unless spoken to. You do not leave my side. and you look at no one but me. If they sense fear, they will attack. If they sense weakness, they will attack. And what should they sense? She asked, turning to face him. They were inches apart. The air between them was electric, charged with the lie they were about to live. Draco looked down at her, his grey eyes darkening. Devotion, he said. They should sense that you are utterly, blindingly obsessed with me, and that I am possessive enough to burn the world if they touch you. I'm not sure I'm that good an actress, she whispered. Draco's lip quirked in a humourless smile. He offered her his arm. Then pray the champagne is strong. The ballroom of Malfoy Manor was a masterpiece of intimidation. The ceiling had been enchanted to mirror the night sky, but devoid of stars, just an endless, crushing void. Floating chandeliers of crystal dripped light like melting ice. The air smelled of expensive perfume, old money and rot. As they descended the grand staircase, the room went silent. Hundreds of eyes turned upward. Hermione felt the weight of their scrutiny like a physical blow. These were the people who had hunted her kind. These were the architects of the war. And now she was descending into their midst, arm in arm with their prince. Draco's grip on her arm tightened. Chin up, he muttered through a fixed smile. Look like you own the place. I feel like I'm walking to the gallows, she hissed back. Then at least you're dressed for the occasion. They reached the floor, and the sharks began to circle. Draco, a smooth, oily voice purred. Theodore Nott Sr. stepped out of the crowd, a glass of blood-red wine in his hand. His eyes, cold and calculating, flicked to Hermione with open disdain. And company. I didn't realize we were allowing pets at the high table. Hermione stiffened. The insult was sharp, designed to draw blood. Draco didn't flinch. He didn't even look angry. He looked bored. He released Hermione's arm only to slide his hand around her waist, pulling her flush against his side. The contact was possessive, firm, and shockingly intimate. Careful not, Draco drawled, his voice carrying effortlessly over the low murmur of the crowd. Hermione is not a pet. She is my personal archivist, and she has done more to restore the family library in 3 days than you have done to restore your reputation in 3 decades. A ripple of uneasy laughter moved through the nearby guests. Nott's eyes narrowed. A bold choice, Nott sneered. Keep an enemy close? I keep what interests me close, Draco replied, his fingers digging slightly into Hermione's hip, a silent signal to stay still. And right now, I am very interested. He turned his back on Nott, dismissing one of the most powerful dark wizards in Britain as if he were a servant. Dance with me, Draco murmured to Hermione, steering her toward the center of the room, where a string quartet had begun a haunting, slow waltz. Draco, you just insulted Nott to his face, Hermione whispered frantically as he pulled her into frame. I asserted dominance, he corrected. He took her right hand in his left, interlacing their fingers. His other hand settled on the small of her back, burning through the silk. If I had apologized, he would have seen it as weakness. By claiming you, I made you untouchable. They began to move. Hermione had expected him to be a stiff dancer, but he moved like water. He led her with subtle, commanding pressure, guiding her through the intricate steps of the waltz, as if they had been dancing together for years. The world around them blurred into streaks of color and light. You're trembling again, he noted softly, looking down at her. Everyone is staring, she said. keeping her eyes fixed on the knot of his tie. "They look like they want to kill me." "Look at me," he commanded. She hesitated, then lifted her eyes to his. The world fell away. The sneering faces, the dark magic, the mission. It all dissolved into the grey of his eyes. He wasn't looking at her like a prop. He was looking at her with an intensity that made her knees weak. "Focus on me," he whispered, pulling her closer until their chests brushed. "Let them stare. Let them hate. In this circle, right now, you are safe. I have you." "Why?" she asked, the question slipping out. "Why go this far? You could have hired a pureblood escort. You could have come alone." Draco spun her, the movement swift and graceful. For a moment, she was breathless, suspended in his arms. "Because," he said, his voice dropping to a rasp, "I didn't want a pureblood escort. I wanted someone who makes me feel alive, even if it's just a lie." Hermione's heart stuttered. A lie. She had to remember that. This was a play. He was the heir. She was the spy. But the way his thumb was stroking the skin of her hand, the way his body shielded hers from the room, it didn't feel like a lie. "Draco," she breathed, warning or invitation she didn't know. "Don't speak," he murmured, his gaze dropping to her lips. "Just dance. For tonight, let's just pretend this is real, that we aren't who we are, that I'm not a monster and you aren't, whatever it is you are hiding." Hermione froze. Whatever it is you are hiding. He knew. He had to know. But he didn't pull away. Instead, he pulled her closer, eliminating the last inch of space between them. She could feel the hard lines of his body, the heat of him. Her head found the hollow of his shoulder naturally, as if it belonged there. They moved together in the center of the gilded cage, two enemies holding onto each other, as if they were the only solid things in a dissolving world. For the first time in her life, Hermione Granger forgot the mission. She forgot the ledger. She forgot the Aurors waiting for her signal. All she could feel was the man holding her, a man who was supposedly heartless, yet whose heart was beating frantically against hers. The music swelled to a crescendo. Draco dipped her, a dramatic, sweeping motion that drew gasps from the crowd. He held her there, suspended above the floor, his face inches from hers. "Don't let me fall," she whispered, her eyes wide. Draco's expression softened, a crack in the ice that revealed a glimpse of the boy he might have been if the war hadn't broken him. "Never," he vowed. He pulled her back up, but he didn't let go. Even as the music ended and polite applause scattered through the room, he held her hand. "Come," he said abruptly, his voice tight. "We've made our point. I can't breathe in here anymore." He led her not toward the exit, but toward the French doors that opened onto the terrace. The cold night air hit them like a slap. The rain had stopped, leaving the world glistening and sharp. Draco walked to the stone balustrade and gripped it with both hands, his knuckles white. He took deep, shuddering breaths as if he had been drowning. Hermione stood a few feet behind him, watching his back. She should go back inside. She should search for the ledger while he was distracted. But she couldn't move. "Draco," she asked softly. He didn't turn. "They want me to take the mark," he said, his voice flat. "The inner circle. They want me to repledge my loyalty tonight, to prove I am my father's son." Hermione felt a chill of horror. "And will you?" He turned around slowly. The moonlight washed him in silver, making him look like a ghost. He looked at her, at the dress he had bought her, at the necklace he had placed on her throat. "I look at them," he said, and I see only rot. But if I refuse, they will kill me, and they will kill you for standing next to me." He walked over to her, stopping just within reach. He reached out and touched her cheek, his fingers trembling slightly. "You should run, Granger," he whispered. "While the gates are open, run and don't look back." "I can't," she said. And it was the truth. She couldn't leave the mission, and she couldn't leave him. Draco stared at her, searching for the lie and finding only a terrifying resolve. "Then you are a fool," he murmured. He leaned down. For a heartbeat, she thought he would kiss her. Her eyes fluttered shut, her lips parting slightly. She wanted it. God help her. She wanted it more than she wanted to breathe. But he didn't. He pressed his forehead against hers, a gesture of intimacy that was somehow more devastating than a kiss. They stood there in the moonlight, breathing the same air, two soldiers on opposite sides of a war, realizing with dawn-breaking horror that they had forgotten which side they were on. "I hate this," he whispered against her skin. "I hate what I am." "Then change it," she whispered back. Draco pulled back, his eyes hardening again, the mask sliding back into place. But the damage was done. She had seen him. "It's not that simple," he said, his voice cold once more. "Let's go. The sharks are waiting." He turned and walked back into the light, leaving her alone in the shadows. Hermione touched her cheek where his fingers had been. Her skin burned. The masquerade was over. But the real danger, the danger of her own heart, was just beginning. She wasn't just undercover anymore. She was under his spell. And she had a terrible feeling that when this house of cards finally fell, she would be the one buried under the rubble. The meeting place was a graveyard of glass and iron, an abandoned botanical conservatory on the outskirts of London. The skeletal remains of the structure jutted into the bruised purple sky, the glass panes long gone, leaving the twisted metal ribs exposed to the wind. Inside, the air smelled of wet earth, dead ivy, and the lingering sulphurous scent of dark magic. Hermione stood 3 paces behind Draco, her hands clasped demurely in front of her, clutching her briefcase. To the casual observer, she was the terrified assistant. But beneath the glamour on her glasses, her eyes were scanning the perimeter, counting exits, calculating spell trajectories. Draco stood in the center of the rotunda, motionless. He wore a heavy black overcoat, the collar turned up against the biting wind. He looked like a statue carved from ice, but Hermione could see the tension in the set of his shoulders. His wand was in his sleeve, not his pocket. "He's late," Hermione whispered, the sound barely audible over the rustle of dry leaves. "He's watching," Draco replied, his lips barely moving. "Testing the perimeter. Keep your head down, Granger. If this goes wrong, you apparate. You don't wait for me." "I'm not leaving you." Draco turned his head slightly, his grey eyes flashing with irritation. That wasn't a request. It was an order. Before she could argue, the shadows at the far end of the conservatory coalesced. 3 figures stepped out of the gloom. The leader was a man Hermione recognized from her Auror files. Victor Crumb's estranged cousin, a smuggler known only as the Wolf. He had a scar running through his left eye and a reputation for skinning his enemies alive. "Malfoy," the Wolf grunted, his voice like gravel. "You brought a girl. I thought we were discussing serious business." "She holds the galleons," Draco drawled, his voice bored, arrogant. "And unlike your associates, she knows how to count." The wolf sneered, stepping closer. The air grew heavy. Hermione felt the familiar prickle of a privacy ward going up, or an anti-apparition jinx. "The price has gone up," the wolf said, spitting on the cracked mosaic floor. "Nott pays better. He says you're weak. He says the Malfoy empire is crumbling." "Nott is a desperate man throwing coins at a sinking ship," Draco said, stepping forward. "I am the ocean. You deal with me, or you drown." It happened in a heartbeat. The wolf didn't signal. He simply raised his wand. But it wasn't a negotiation tactic. It was an execution. "Avada!" Draco moved faster than Hermione had ever seen, knocking the killing curse aside with a violent slash of his wand. A jet of green light shattered a stone pillar behind them. Debris rained down. "Down!" Draco roared, shoving Hermione behind a rusted planter. Spells erupted from all sides. Red and purple lights slashed through the gloom. The two men with the wolf flanked them, firing curses that boiled the air. Draco was good, brilliant even, his dueling style precise and elegant. He shielded and struck in a fluid dance, disarming one attacker with a bone-breaking hex. But there were three of them, and they were killers. A purple curse, a nasty organ-liquefying hex, slipped past Draco's guard. It caught him in the side. Draco didn't scream. He made a sharp, wet sound, stumbling back. He dropped to one knee, clutching his ribs. Blood, dark and copious, immediately began to seep through his fingers. The wolf laughed, stepping over the debris, raising his wand for the kill. "Goodbye, little prince." Hermione looked at Draco. He was pale, his eyes unfocused, death reflected in his pupils. Something inside her snapped. The archivist died. The Auror was born. She didn't think about her cover. She didn't think about the mission. She vaulted over the planter, her movement fluid and deadly. She didn't cast a shield, she cast an offense. Confringo Maxima. The blast was blinding. It hit the ground at the wolf's feet, exploding the mosaic floor with the force of a grenade. The smuggler was thrown backward, crashing into the iron framework of the wall. The remaining henchmen spun toward her, eyes wide. "The girl! Expulso!" Hermione screamed, putting the full force of her magical core into the spell. The man was blasted off his feet, flying through the open gap in the wall and into the night. She spun around, her wand a blur. She deflected a stray curse from the wolf, who was struggling to stand, and sent a cutting hex that severed the wand from his hand. He howled in pain. Silence fell over the ruins, broken only by the groans of the defeated men and the ragged sound of Draco's breathing. Hermione rushed to him. He was slumped against the planter, his hand pressed to his side. The blood was everywhere, soaking his coat, pooling on the floor. "Draco!" she gasped, falling to her knees beside him. He looked up at her. His eyes were hazy with pain, but there was something else there. Shock. Pure, unadulterated shock. He had seen her. He'd seen the way she moved, the way she cast. "Who?" he rasped, blood bubbling at the corner of his lips. "Who are you?" "Hold on," she commanded, her voice shaking. She grabbed his arm, pulling it over her shoulder. "We have to move. The wards are down." "Too heavy," he mumbled, his head lolling. "Shut up and stand up, Malfoy," she hissed, adrenaline giving her strength she didn't know she had. She hauled him to his feet. He was dead weight, leaning entirely on her. She gripped his waist, her hand coming away warm and sticky with his blood. The sensation made her nauseous, but she focused on the destination. Not the manor, not the ministry, somewhere safe. She turned on her heel. The world compressed, twisted, and popped. They landed hard on the wooden floor of a safe house Hermione had prepared weeks ago, a small, dusty cottage in the Scottish Highlands. The air smelled of stale pine and neglect. Draco collapsed immediately, dragging her down with him. They hit the floor in a tangle of limbs. Hermione scrambled up, her hands trembling uncontrollably now that the fight was over. "Draco!" She crawled over to him. He was conscious, but barely. His skin was the color of parchment. The wound in his side was gruesome, a jagged tear through his shirt and flesh that pulsed with dark purple energy. "Dark magic," she whispered, panic rising in her throat. "It's resisting the clotting." "Bag," Draco wheezed, pointing a shaking finger at his inner pocket. "Dittany isn't enough." Hermione ripped his coat open, the buttons popping off and skittering across the floor. She tore his shirt open, exposing his chest. He was lean, scarred, and covered in blood. She found the small pouch in his pocket and dumped it out. Vials clattered onto the floor. She grabbed a silver flask, essence of myrtlap, mixed with phoenix tears, high-grade healing. "This is going to hurt," she warned. Draco gritted his teeth, his head thrown back, the cords of his neck straining. "Do it." She poured the potion directly into the wound. Draco arched off the floor, a guttural scream of agony tearing from his throat. His hand shot out and gripped her wrist, squeezing so hard she thought he might break the bone. I'm sorry," she sobbed, tears blurring her vision. She used her wand to siphon the corrupted blood, weaving complex healing spells over the jagged flesh. Vulnera Sanentur, over and over. The song-like incantation filled the small room. Slowly, agonizingly, the bleeding slowed. The purple taint faded. The edges of the wound began to knit together. Draco collapsed back onto the floor, panting, his body slick with sweat. His grip on her wrist didn't loosen. Hermione sat back on her heels, her chest heaving. Her hands were covered in his blood. Her dress was ruined. The silence returned, but this time it wasn't empty. It was filled with the terrifying intimacy of survival. Draco turned his head slowly to look at her. His hair was plastered to his forehead. His eyes were clear now, the pain receding enough for his mind to start working again. "You," he whispered. It wasn't a question. It was an accusation. Hermione tried to pull her wrist away, but he held fast. "You cast a confringo with the precision of a dueling champion," he murmured, his voice raspy. "You took out 3 mercenaries in under 10 seconds. You know safe house protocols." I read a lot," she lied weakly, her voice trembling. Draco let out a dry, broken laugh that turned into a cough. He pulled her closer, forcing her to lean over him. "Don't," he hissed. "Don't lie to me. Not now. Not while my blood is drying on your hands." Hermione looked down at him. She was trapped. She had saved his life, but in doing so, she had destroyed her cover. "I did what I had to do," she said softly. "Why?" Draco searched her face, his gaze intense, stripping her bare. "You could have let them kill me. You could have run. You could be free. I couldn't let you die." "Why?" he demanded again, louder this time, desperation leaking into his tone. "Because I don't want a world without you in it," she shouted back, the words tearing out of her before she could check them. The confession hung in the air between them, shocking them both. Draco stared at her, his lips parted. The anger in his eyes drained away, replaced by a profound confusion. He looked at her blood-stained hands, then up to her tear-streaked face. He looked at her as if he had never seen a human being before. He released her wrist, but instead of pushing her away, his hand travelled up her arm, slow and reverent, leaving a streak of red on her skin. His hand cupped her cheek, his thumb brushing away a tear. "You are a fool," he whispered, his voice cracking. "You are a beautiful, dangerous fool." Hermione leaned into his touch, her eyes closing. She was exhausted. She was terrified, but she felt safe. Here, on the floor of a dusty cottage covered in blood, she felt safer than she ever had in the ministry. "You need to rest," she whispered, opening her eyes. "I can't," he murmured, his eyes drifting shut as the exhaustion took over. "If I sleep, you might disappear. You might turn back into a ghost." "I'm not going anywhere," she promised. She conjured a blanket and covered him, but she didn't move away. She sat beside him, watching the rise and fall of his chest. Draco Malfoy, the boy who had made her childhood a misery, the man who led a criminal empire, lay vulnerable at her feet. And Hermione Granger, the Order's brightest star, sat keeping watch over him like a guardian angel. She looked at her hands again. The blood was drying, turning rusty and dark. It wasn't just blood. It was a bond. He suspected her. He knew she was more than she claimed, but he hadn't cast her out. He hadn't attacked her. He had let her heal him. He had touched her cheek with a tenderness that broke her heart. Outside, the wind howled across the moors, but inside, the storm had shifted. It was no longer about the mission. It was about the man. Hermione pulled her knees to her chest and rested her chin on them, watching him sleep. The conflict was no longer external. The war was now inside her. She had to destroy the syndicate. She had to find the ledger. But looking at the scars on his chest, seeing the pain etched into his face even in sleep, she realized the impossible truth. To save the world, she would have to destroy him, and she wasn't sure she could do it anymore. "Who are you?" she whispered into the silence, asking the question he had asked her. But the answer wasn't simple. He wasn't just a villain, and she wasn't just a hero. They were two bleeding things in the dark, trying to find a way to the light, unaware that they were leading each other off a cliff. The cottage was a ship adrift in a sea of darkness. Outside, the wind had picked up, howling across the barren Scottish moors like a wounded beast, rattling the loose window panes in their rot-eaten frames. Inside, the world had shrunk to the circle of firelight flickering from the hearth and the ragged sound of Draco Malfoy's breathing. Hermione sat on the edge of the narrow, dusty bed, wringing out a cloth in a basin of cool water. Her hands were raw, the skin scrubbed pink in a desperate attempt to wash away the blood. His blood, the attacker's blood. But the metallic smell seemed to have seeped into her pores. She looked down at him. Draco was burning. The dark curse he had taken to the ribs was no longer bleeding, but the magical infection was fighting a war against his system. He tossed and turned on the thin mattress, his sheets tangled around his legs, his skin slick with a sheen of sweat that made him look like he was carved from feverish marble. "No," he muttered, his voice a dry, cracked whisper. His head thrashed to the side, brow furrowed in pain. "Not enough. It's never enough." Hermione reached out, placing the cool, damp cloth on his forehead. He flinched at the touch, a violent, instinctive jerk, his hand shooting up to grip her wrist. His fingers were searing hot, his grip bruising. "Draco," she whispered, keeping her voice low and steady, the way one speaks to a frightened animal. "It's me. You're safe." His eyes flew open. They were blown wide, the grey irises swallowed by black pupils. He looked at her, but he didn't see her. He was seeing ghosts. The occlumency shields that usually turned his mind into an impenetrable fortress had crumbled under the fever, leaving the raw, bleeding psyche exposed. "You," he breathed, his gaze darting frantically over her face. "You're still here. Why are you still here?" "I'm tending to you," she said softly. "The fever needs to break." "Leave," he rasped, trying to push her away, but his arm was trembling so badly he barely moved her. "You have to leave, before he comes back, before the walls close." "Who, Draco? Who is coming?" "The dark," he whispered, staring up at the ceiling as if watching shadows gather there. "It eats everything. It ate my father. It's eating me." Hermione's heart ached, a sharp physical pang in her chest. This wasn't the arrogant heir to a criminal empire. This was the boy who had been forced to take the dark mark at 16. This was the wreckage left behind after the war ended for everyone else, but continued for him. "You are not your father," she said firmly, leaning closer. "You are Draco." He let out a jagged, humorless laugh that turned into a cough. "Draco." He mocked the name, tasting the bitterness of it. "A constellation, a dragon, a monster." He turned his head to look at her, and the clarity in his fever-bright eyes was terrifying. "Do you know what it's like?" he asked, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "To stand in a room full of people who want to kill you, smiling like you own them. To know that one slip, one wrong word, and you're meat?" "I can imagine," she said, thinking of her own double life, the lies she spun every day. "No," he shook his head violently. "You can't. You have a light inside you, Granger. I can see it. It burns." He reached up, his trembling fingers hovering inches from her face, as if afraid to touch her. "I have nothing but cold. I am a vessel for their ambition. I am the gilded cage." Hermione captured his hand, pressing it against her cheek. She needed him to feel something real. She needed to anchor him. "You saved me tonight," she reminded him. "A monster wouldn't have done that." "I didn't save you," he murmured, his thumb brushing the line of her jaw, leaving a trail of heat. "I was selfish. I couldn't bear to see the light go out. If you die, the dark wins completely, and I am so tired of the dark." The confession hung in the air, fragile and devastating. Hermione looked at him, really looked at him. The lines of pain around his mouth, the scars on his chest that told stories of torture she hadn't read in any file. He wasn't a villain plotting world domination. He was a prisoner of his own legacy, a man holding up the sky because he was terrified of what would happen if he let go. And she was the one holding the knife to his back. The guilt crashed into her, a wave of nausea. She was here to destroy him, to find the ledger, to send the Aurors, to burn his house to the ground. Every moment of kindness she offered him felt like a betrayal of her mission, or of him. She didn't know which one was worse anymore. "Rest, Draco," she whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. "Just sleep." "Stay," he pleaded, his grip on her hand tightening again. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a child's fear of the dark. Don't go to the shadows. Stay where I can see you. I'm staying, she promised. She moved from the edge of the bed to the chair beside it, but he wouldn't let go of her hand. So she sat awkwardly, her body twisted, holding onto him as the storm raged outside. Hours passed. The fire died down to glowing embers. The shadows in the corners of the room stretched and danced. Hermione watched him sleep. The fever was breaking. His breathing had deepened, the frantic edge smoothing out. But his face remained troubled, his brow furrowed even in dreams. She thought about the Ledger of Souls. It was the key to everything. With it, she could end the syndicate. She could free the wizarding world from the Malfoy grip. She could go back to her life, her simple, safe, lonely life. But looking at him now, she realized that destroying the syndicate meant destroying him. There would be no mercy for the head of the family. He would rot in Azkaban or receive the kiss. He trusts no one, the dossier had said. He is incapable of emotional connection. The dossier was wrong. He was capable. He was just starving for it. Draco stirred, a low groan escaping his lips. He shifted, turning onto his side, facing her. His eyes fluttered open. The glassy haze was gone, replaced by the dull ache of exhaustion, but he was lucid. He looked at their joined hands. Then he looked up at her face. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence was thick with the things he had said in his delirium, the truths that could not be unsaid. Draco didn't pull his hand away. Instead, he slowly pulled her toward him. "Come here," he whispered. "Draco, your ribs. To hell with my ribs." He tugged again, weaker this time, but insistent. Hermione hesitated, then carefully climbed onto the narrow bed, lying down beside him on top of the covers. She kept a respectful distance, careful of his wound. Draco closed the gap. He shifted until his forehead rested against her shoulder. He let out a long, shuddering exhale, his body finally relaxing into the mattress. "You stayed," he said, his voice muffled against her coat. "I told you I would." "People usually leave," he murmured. "Or they take what they want and run." "I'm not people," she whispered, her heart hammering against her ribs. "I am the one who will take everything from you," her conscience screamed. Draco moved his hand, sliding it across the space between them until it rested on her waist. It wasn't sexual. It was grounding. He was checking to make sure she was real. "Who taught you to fight like that?" he asked quietly, the question from the battle finally resurfacing. Hermione stiffened. This was the danger zone. "My father," she lied, blending truth with fiction. "He said the world is dangerous for people like us. He taught me to never be a victim." "He was a wise man," Draco murmured. His fingers traced the pattern of the fabric on her waist. "You were magnificent, Granger. Terrifying, but magnificent." He lifted his head slightly, looking at her in the dim light. His grey eyes were soft, stripped of their usual armour. "I think," he said slowly, as if testing the words, "that I am in trouble." "Why?" "Because," he whispered, leaning in until his lips were inches from hers. "I look at you, and I don't see a mystery to be solved anymore. I see peace, and I haven't felt peace in 10 years. Hermione's breath hitched. She should pull away. She should make a joke, deflect, leave the room. But she didn't. She was drawn to him like a moth to a flame, knowing it would burn, but unable to resist the warmth. "Draco," she breathed. He didn't kiss her. He simply rested his forehead against hers again, closing his eyes. "Just for a moment," he whispered. "Let me have this. No names, no titles, no sides. Just this." Hermione closed her eyes too. A single tear escaped, tracking hot down her temple into her hair. "Okay," she whispered back. "Just for a moment." They lay there in the quiet dark of the safe house, the storm outside a distant memory, the assassin and the target, the spy and the kingpin. But in the space between two heartbeats, they were just a man and a woman, huddled together against the cold, pretending that the morning sun wouldn't turn them back into enemies. But morning was coming, and with it, the choices that would tear them apart. Hermione stared into the darkness over his shoulder, her mind racing. She had the access. She had his trust. She had him exactly where the Ministry wanted him. But as Draco's breathing evened out into true sleep, his hand still clutching her waist as if she were his only lifeline, Hermione knew the terrifying truth. She wasn't undercover anymore. She was under his skin, and extracting herself now would leave a wound that would never heal. "I have to choose," she thought, the realization settling like lead in her stomach. The mission or the man. And for the first time since the war began, Hermione Granger didn't know the answer. The return to Malfoy Manor was not a homecoming. It was a descent back into the underworld. But this time, the darkness felt different. It no longer felt like a cage designed to keep Hermione out. It felt like a fortress designed to keep them in. 2 days had passed since the ambush at the conservatory. 2 days of silence, shadowed corridors, and a tension that had shifted from hostile to heavy, suffocatingly intimate. Hermione sat at the small desk in her guest room, her hands shaking as she burned the small scrap of parchment in the candle flame. The message from Kingsley Shacklebolt had been brief, written in a cipher that only top-tier Aurors knew. Timeline accelerated. Intelligence suggests the syndicate moves the assets in 24 hours. Acquire the ledger. End this. The ashes curled and vanished. The deadline was a noose tightening around her neck. She knew where the ledger was. She had deduced it not through spying, but through listening to Draco in the quiet moments of his recovery. He spoke of a sanctuary, a room attached to his private quarters, warded by blood magic and ancient mechanisms. It was the only place in the house where the portraits couldn't see, where the ghosts couldn't speak. It was where he kept the things he couldn't bear to lose. If the Ledger of Souls existed, it was there. Hermione stood up, smoothing the front of her skirt. She felt sick. The nausea rolled in her stomach, a physical manifestation of her treachery. In the safe house, she had been a woman saving a man. Tonight, she had to be a spy destroying a target. "He trusts you," a treacherous voice whispered in her mind. "He looks at you and sees a savior." "He's a criminal," she reminded herself, forcing the aura mask back into place. "He's the head of a dark empire." But the mask didn't fit as well as it used to. She walked through the silent corridors toward the east wing. The house seemed to hold its breath. The storm outside had settled into a sullen, weeping drizzle, tapping against the glass like impatient fingers. She reached the heavy oak doors of Draco's private suite. She didn't knock. He had given her permission to enter, a privilege no one else in the household held. The room was dim, lit only by the low glow of the fire. It smelled of him, sandalwood, medicinal salves, and the crisp scent of ozone. Draco was standing by the window, his back to her. He was wearing black trousers and a loose white shirt, unbuttoned to reveal the fresh bandages wrapped around his ribs. He didn't turn when she entered. He knew her steps. "You're up," Hermione said softly, closing the door behind her. The click of the latch sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. "The pain is manageable," Draco said, his voice rough. He turned slowly. His face was pale, the sharp angles of his cheekbones more pronounced, but his eyes were alert. They locked onto hers immediately, a magnetic pull that made her breath hitch. "You should be resting," she chided gently, walking toward him. "The healer said." "The healer is a fool who thinks rest cures a rot," Draco cut in, though there was no bite in his tone. He watched her approach with a hunger he didn't bother to hide anymore. "And I cannot sleep. The silence. It's too loud tonight." Hermione stopped a few feet from him. "Then let me change the dressing. The dittany needs to be reapplied." It was a pretext, a way to get close, a way to touch him. Draco nodded, his gaze never leaving her face. He unbuttoned the rest of his shirt and let it slide off his shoulders. Hermione's breath caught. His torso was a map of violence. The Sectum Sempra scars from 6th year, the new angry red slash from the conservatory, and older, fainter marks from a childhood spent in a war zone. But he was also beautiful, lean muscle and alabaster skin, a fallen angel made of marble and pain. She reached for the jar of salve on the bedside table, warming a small amount in her hands. "Tell me, Granger," he murmured as she stepped into his personal space. "Why do your hands shake?" Hermione froze. Her fingers were trembling as she reached for his ribs. "Because I'm afraid I'll hurt you," she lied. It was a half-truth. She was afraid she would destroy him. "You can't hurt me," Draco whispered, looking down at the top of her head. "Not in the way you think." She applied the salve, her fingers moving in slow, circular motions over the healing wound. His skin was hot. Under her palm, she could feel the steady, powerful thud of his heart. Thump, thump, thump. It was the rhythm of a life she was about to ruin. As she worked, her eyes drifted to his neck. There, resting against his collarbone, was a silver chain. Hanging from it was a small, intricate key made of black iron, etched with runes that seemed to writhe and change shape. The key to the sanctuary. Her heart rate spiked. She needed that key. Or at least, she needed to disable the wards it controlled. "What is this?" she asked softly, her fingers brushing the cool metal of the key as if by accident. Draco flinched, his hand flying up to cover hers, trapping her fingers against his chest. For a moment, she thought she was caught, but he didn't look angry. He looked vulnerable. "The burden," he said quietly. "The keys to the kingdom, or the dungeon, depending on your perspective." "It looks heavy," she whispered, meeting his eyes. Draco stared at her, a war waging behind his grey irises. He was deciding something, weighing the risk. Finally, he let out a long sigh and released her hand, but he didn't pull away. "Come," he said abruptly. "I want to show you something." He took her hand, his grip firm, possessive, and led her toward a bookshelf on the far wall. He pulled a specific volume, and the shelf swung inwards silently, revealing a narrow stone passage. Hermione's pulse roared in her ears. This is it. They walked down the short corridor, which opened into a circular room. The sanctuary. It wasn't what she expected. She had anticipated a vault of dark artifacts, a war room. Instead, it was a room of glass. The ceiling was a domed skylight, magnified to show the heavens in breathtaking detail. The walls were lined not with weapons, but with instruments, astrolabes, telescopes, and shelves of vinyl records. In the center sat a black grand piano, its lid open. It was a place of beauty, a place of peace. And there, in the corner, sat a heavy iron safe embedded into the stone wall, the ledger. "I've never brought anyone in here," Draco said, his voice echoing slightly in the domed space. He walked to the window, looking up at the stars. "Not my mother. Not him. This is the only place in the world where I am not a Malfoy. I am just me." Hermione stood in the doorway, feeling like an intruder in a church. She had manipulated him into this. She had used his loneliness as a pry bar. "It's beautiful," she said, her voice hollow. "It's a tomb," he corrected, turning to face her. "A place for dead dreams. I wanted to be an astronomer. Did you know that? Before the mark, before the blood." "You still could be," she said, stepping into the room. "No." He shook his head, a sad smile playing on his lips. "The stars don't forgive, Granger. They just watch." He walked over to the safe. Hermione held her breath. He touched the dial, and the runes on the iron glowed faintly. He didn't open it. He just rested his hand on the cold metal. "Everything that binds me is in here," he said softly. "The debts, the names, the sins of my father. If I destroyed it, the syndicate would collapse. But so would I. I am tethered to it." "Maybe you need someone to cut the tether," she whispered. Draco looked at her, the air in the room charged with electricity. He walked toward her, slow and deliberate, until he was standing inches away. The moonlight from the dome above washed him in silver. "Is that what you are?" he asked, his voice low and intense. "Are you the blade?" Hermione looked up at him. She saw the conflict in his eyes, the fear of betrayal warring with the desperate need to trust. "I don't know what I am anymore," she admitted. "Good," he murmured. "Certainty is boring." He reached out and cupped her face with both hands. His thumbs stroked her cheekbones. He was looking at her as if she were the only star in his sky. "I trust you," he whispered. The words were a physical blow. They hit her harder than any curse. "I trust you." "Draco, don't," she started, panic rising. "I do," he insisted. "I trust you with this room. I trust you with my life. And that terrifies me more than the Dark Lord ever did." He leaned down. Hermione saw it coming, and for a split second she thought about stopping him. She thought about her duty. She thought about Kingsley and the mission. But then his lips touched hers, and the world dissolved. It wasn't a tentative kiss. It was a collision. It was desperate, hungry, and filled with a pent-up longing that had been brewing since they first met in the rain. Draco kissed her like a drowning man breathing air. He tasted of mint and fire whiskey and sorrow. Hermione let out a small sound, a whimper of surrender, and melted into him. Her hands came up to grip his shoulders, then slid into his hair. She pulled him closer, her body molding against his. The spy was gone. The aura was gone. There was only the woman and the man who made her feel like she was burning alive. Draco groaned low in his throat, his arms wrapping around her waist, lifting her slightly off the ground. He walked her backward until her back hit the cool stone wall. He pressed against her, his hardness, his heat, overwhelming her senses. "Hermione," he breathed against her lips, using her real name. It sounded like a prayer. She tilted her head back, gasping for air as his mouth moved to her jaw, then her neck. His hand fumbled with the clasp of her cloak, pushing it off her shoulders. As he kissed the sensitive spot beneath her ear, Hermione's hand brushed against his chest. Her fingers found the cold iron key. Reality crashed back in. The key, the safe, the ledger. She squeezed her eyes shut, tears leaking out. She was kissing him, and she was stealing from him. It was the ultimate betrayal. "Do it," the voice of the Auror screamed. "Take the key. Open the safe. End the war." "I love him," the voice of the woman whispered, a terrifying realization that nearly buckled her knees. She didn't take the key. Not yet. Instead, she wrapped her arms tighter around his neck, pulling him back to her lips. She kissed him with a fierce, apologetic intensity. She kissed him to memorize the taste of him, because she knew that after tonight, he would never let her touch him again. Draco pulled back slightly, his forehead resting against hers, his breathing ragged. His eyes were dark, dilated, full of a raw, naked emotion that shattered her heart. "You make me want to burn the world down," he whispered, "just so I can build a new one for you." Hermione sobbed, a dry, choking sound. "Draco!" "Shh," he soothed, misinterpreting her distress. He kissed her forehead. "I know, it's dangerous, but I don't care anymore." He stepped back, taking her hand. He led her toward the grand piano, not the safe. "Play for me?" he asked softly. "Or just sit with me. I don't want to think about the ledger. I don't want to think about the war." Hermione looked at the safe in the corner. It was right there. She had the access. She had the location. She knew the key was around his neck. "I'll sit with you," she whispered. She sat on the piano bench. Draco sat beside her, their thighs touching. He began to play, a slow, melancholy melody that sounded like rain falling on a grave. Hermione watched his hands, the hands of a killer, the hands of a pianist, the hands of the man she loved. She had the intelligence. She would report the location to Kingsley. The Aurors would raid the manor. They would blow the safe. They would arrest him. She leaned her head on his shoulder, closing her eyes as the music washed over her. "I'm sorry," she whispered into the music, the words too soft for him to hear. "I'm so sorry." Tonight, she was in his arms. Tomorrow, she would be his executioner. And as Draco played, unaware that the woman he was falling for was calculating the exact coordinates of his destruction, the tragedy of their story settled over the room like a shroud. The gilded cage was open, but neither of them could fly away. The storm did not merely rage, it besieged the manor. Thunder cracked like a whip against the stone walls, shaking the foundations of the ancestral home. Rain lashed against the high, arched windows of the library in sheets of grey violence, blurring the world outside into a chaotic smear. Inside, the air was thick, pressurized, charged with enough static electricity to make the fine hairs on Hermione's arms stand on end. She could not sit. She paced the length of the Persian rug, her heels sinking into the deep pile, her mind a frantic blur of coordinates and codes. She knew where the ledger was. She had the key's location visualized in her mind, hanging against Draco's sternum, warm from his skin. She had the timeline from Kingsley. The extraction team was on standby. All she had to do was send the signal. "Do it," the aura inside her commanded. "Go to your room. Send the Patronus. End the war." But her feet wouldn't move toward the door. They kept pacing, circling the fireplace where the flames roared, fighting a losing battle against the damp chill seeping through the walls. The library doors creaked open. Draco entered. He looked as if he had been walking through the storm itself. His hair was damp, plastered to his forehead. His white shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, clinging to his chest. He carried a decanter of amber liquid in one hand and 2 glasses in the other. He didn't look at her immediately. He walked to the nearest table, set the glasses down with a sharp clink, and poured. His hands were steady, but his movements had a jagged, forceful quality to them. "The wards are screaming," he said, his voice low, cutting through the rumble of thunder. "I've never felt the ambient magic this volatile. It's as if the house knows." Hermione stopped pacing. She wrapped her arms around herself, a futile attempt to hold her shattering composure together. "Knows what?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Draco turned to look at her. The firelight cast deep shadows across his face, turning his eyes into pools of mercury. He looked haunted. He looked beautiful. "That something is ending," he murmured. He picked up the glasses and walked toward her. "Or beginning. I can't tell the difference anymore." He held a glass out to her. She took it, her fingers brushing his. The shock was immediate, a spark that snapped between them, audible in the quiet room. Neither pulled away. "Drink," he ordered softly. "You look like you're about to shatter." Hermione took a sip. The fire whiskey burned its way down her throat, settling in her stomach like a hot coal. It didn't chase away the cold dread, but it dulled the sharp edges of her panic. "Draco," she started, not knowing what she was going to say. "Run! Get out! I'm going to destroy you!" "Don't!" he interrupted. He stepped closer, invading her space, his presence overwhelming. He smelled of rain and ozone, and that dark, addictive scent that was purely him. "Don't talk about the war. Don't talk about the syndicate. Tonight, the world stops at those windows." "We can't just ignore it," she argued, though her resistance was melting like wax. "It's out there, waiting." "Let it wait," he growled. He set his glass down on the mantelpiece and turned to her fully. The air between them thickened, heavy with the unspoken things that had been building for weeks. The glances, the touches, the shared silence in the sanctuary. "You've been avoiding me all day," he accused, stepping closer until she was forced to back up against the heavy oak table. "Since the piano, since the safe." Hermione's heart slammed against her ribs. "I needed to think." "About what?" "About choices, about consequences." Draco let out a harsh laugh. He placed his hands on the table on either side of her, trapping her. He leaned down, his face inches from hers. She could see the flecks of silver in his irises, the slight tremor in his jaw. "There are no choices left, Hermione," he whispered, using her name like a weapon. "We are on a train that has already left the station. The only choice left is who you want to be sitting next to when it crashes." That's a fatalistic way to look at it. "It's the truth," he countered, his voice dropping to a desperate rasp. "Look at me. Tell me you don't feel it. This thing between us. It's not just survival. It's not just loneliness." He freed one hand to touch her face. His thumb traced her lower lip, dragging it down slightly. Hermione's breath hitched. Her body betrayed her, leaning into his touch, craving the contact. "It's dangerous," she whispered, her eyes fluttering shut. "I don't care," he vowed. Lightning flashed, illuminating the room in a stark, blinding white. In that split second, Hermione saw him, stripped of his titles, his crimes, his arrogance. He was just a man terrified of being alone, and she was the woman who had the power to break him. Draco, she sobbed, the word tearing out of her throat. She grabbed the lapels of his shirt and pulled him down. The kiss wasn't gentle. It was a collision of galaxies. It was frantic, messy, and desperate. Draco groaned, a low, guttural sound that vibrated against her lips, and wrapped his arms around her waist, lifting her onto the edge of the table. Glass shattered somewhere, perhaps a vase knocked over in their haste. But neither cared. His hands were everywhere, in her hair, on her waist, gripping her thighs to pull her flush against him. He kissed her as if he were trying to consume her, to breathe her into his lungs so he would never have to be without her again. Hermione kissed him back with the ferocity of a goodbye. She poured every ounce of her guilt, her love, and her sorrow into the contact. "I'm sorry," she screamed silently against his mouth. "I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I love you." "Granger," he gasped, breaking the kiss to bury his face in the crook of her neck. He bit down gently on the sensitive cord of muscle there, making her arch her back with a cry. "You are undoing me. You are ruining me." "Good," she whispered, her hands tangling in his platinum hair, pulling him closer. "Let me." He swept everything off the table with one violent motion of his arm. Books, quills, parchment. They clattered to the floor, forgotten. He laid her back against the polished wood, his body hovering over hers, a shield against the storm. He looked down at her, his chest heaving. The hunger in his eyes was naked, terrifying in its intensity. But beneath the lust, there was reverence. He looked at her as if she were a holy thing he wasn't sure he was allowed to touch. "Stop me," he pleaded hoarsely. "Tell me to stop, because if I touch you now, I will never be able to let you go. I will burn the world to keep you." Hermione looked up at him. She saw the trap closing. She saw the future crumbling. And in that moment, she made the most selfish decision of her life. She reached up and undid the first button of his shirt. "Don't let go," she whispered. Draco made a sound that was half prayer, half curse. He captured her lips again, and the last of the walls came down. There was no finesse, no practiced seduction. It was raw need. Clothes were discarded in a frenzy of fumbling hands and torn fabric. The cold air of the library bit at their skin, only to be chased away by the searing heat of their bodies. When they finally joined, it was a surrender. Hermione gasped, her nails digging into his shoulders, anchoring herself as the world spun. Draco buried his face in her hair, murmuring things she couldn't catch, broken phrases in French, her name, promises he couldn't keep. The storm outside raged on, thunder shaking the floorboards beneath the table, but Hermione heard nothing but the sound of his breathing, felt nothing but the crushing weight of his body and the terrifying perfection of him. It was an act of defiance against the war, against the sides they were forced to choose, against the inevitability of the morning. For an hour, they existed in a vacuum where time didn't matter. There was only the friction of skin, the taste of sweat and salt, the desperate, clawing need to be one person, because being two was too painful. Later, hours later, or perhaps minutes, the fire had died down to glowing embers. They lay on the thick rug before the hearth, Draco's heavy fur-lined cloak thrown over them. Hermione lay with her head on his chest, listening to his heart slow its frantic rhythm. His arm was wrapped tightly around her, his hand idly stroking her bare arm. The silence that settled over the room was heavy. But it wasn't the silence of awkwardness. It was the silence of a cathedral after the hymn has ended. Hermione stared into the dying fire. The adrenaline was fading, and in its wake, the cold reality was creeping back in. She lay in the arms of the enemy. She had given him her body. She had taken his heart, and tomorrow she would take his life. The guilt was a physical pain, a sharp knife twisting in her gut. She felt tears prick her eyes and squeeze them shut, terrified he would notice. "What are you thinking?" Draco's voice rumbled in his chest, low and sleepy. Hermione stiffened. She couldn't tell him the truth. "I'm thinking about how I'm going to report you to the ministry at dawn." "I'm thinking about the storm," she lied, her voice thick. "It's quieting down." Draco tightened his hold on her. "Let it pass. We're safe here." He shifted, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "I never thought," he started, then paused. "I never thought I could feel this. I thought I was dead inside, Hermione. Burnt out." "You're not dead," she whispered, tracing a scar on his chest with her fingertip. "No," he agreed softly. "You woke me up. You walked into this house of ghosts and you lit a fire." He tilted her chin up so she had to look at him. His expression was open, vulnerable, stripped of all the Malfoy armor. "I love you," he said. The words were simple, quiet, absolute. Hermione's heart stopped. She felt the blood drain from her face. She had expected desire. She had expected obsession. She hadn't expected this pure, unadulterated confession. It shattered her. She couldn't say it back. If she said it back, it would be a lie. Because if she truly loved him enough, she wouldn't do what she was about to do. Or maybe it would be the truth, and that was even worse. Instead, she surged up and kissed him, silencing him. She kissed him with a frantic, sorrowful intensity, trying to put all her apologies into the motion. Draco accepted the kiss, mistaking her desperation for passion. He pulled her closer, wrapping her in his warmth. "Sleep," he murmured against her lips as they settled back down. "I'll keep watch. Nothing touches you tonight." Hermione closed her eyes, but sleep was a distant country. She lay there as Draco's breathing evened out, as his grip on her relaxed, but didn't let go. She waited. She waited until the grandfather clock in the hall chimed 3. She waited until she was certain he was in the deep, dreamless sleep of the exhausted. Then, with the slow, agonizing movements of a woman dismantling a bomb, she began to extricate herself from his arms. Draco murmured something in his sleep, his hand grasping at the empty space where she had been. But he didn't wake. Hermione stood up, shivering in the cold air. She gathered her scattered clothes, dressing quickly, her hands trembling so hard she could barely fasten the buttons. She looked at him one last time. He looked peaceful, younger. The lines of stress were smoothed away. He looked like the boy he should have been. "I love you too," she whispered into the darkness, the words tasting like ash. "That's why I have to stop you." She turned away, tears finally spilling over, hot and fast. She walked toward the door, every step a betrayal. She didn't look back. She couldn't. She left the library, left the warmth, left the man who had just given her his soul, and walked into the cold shadows of the corridor. The storm outside had passed, but the storm inside had just begun to scream. She headed for the sanctuary. She didn't need the key anymore. She had seen the runes when he opened the safe. She remembered the sequence. It was time to end it. The sanctuary was colder than she remembered. Without Draco's presence to warm it, the glass-domed room felt less like a cathedral and more like a morgue. The moonlight that filtered through the ceiling was harsh, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air like tiny, suspended ghosts. Hermione stood before the black iron safe. Her hands were trembling so violently that she had to clasp them together to steady them. She wasn't wearing the silk dress anymore. She was dressed in her tactical gear, dragon hide boots, dark trousers, a fitted tunic. She looked like what she was, a soldier. "Focus," she commanded herself. "You are an Auror. You have a job to do." But her mind kept flashing back to the library, to the rug, to the way Draco had whispered, "I love you," against her skin. She squeezed her eyes shut, a sob catching in her throat. She shoved the memory into a box in her mind and slammed the lid shut. She couldn't afford to be Hermione Granger right now. She had to be the weapon. She reached out and touched the cold iron of the safe. She didn't have the key. It was still around Draco's neck, rising and falling with his breath in the library. But she didn't need it. She had watched him. She had memorized the sequence of runes he had traced. Algiz, Thurisaz, Isa, protection, chaos, ice. Her finger traced the shapes on the dial. The metal hummed under her touch, recognizing the pattern, if not the magical signature. It resisted for a moment, the ancient wards tasting her intent, but the Malfoy blood magic was weakened by the Master's emotional instability. And perhaps the house recognized her now. She had been claimed by the heir. Click. The heavy iron door swung open with a groan that sounded like a dying breath. There it was, the Ledger of Souls. It wasn't a book. It was a stack of vellum scrolls bound in silver, pulsing with a faint, sickly light. It contained the names of every corrupted official, every dark artifact trafficked, every murder sanctioned by the syndicate for the last 50 years. It was the end of the Malfoy Empire. Hermione reached in and grabbed it. The leather was cold and felt greasy, as if coated in residue. She put it in her expanded beaded bag. Now came the hardest part, the signal. She walked to the center of the room, under the starlight. She raised her vinewood wand. "Expecto Patronum," she whispered. She had to dig deep for a happy memory. The library was tainted. The waltz was a lie. She went back further, to before the war, to sitting by the lake with Harry and Ron. A silvery otter burst from the tip of her wand. It swam through the air, glowing bright and pure against the shadows of the room. "Go to Kingsley," she said, her voice shaking. "Message. The bird is in the cage. I have the package. Execute the raid. Now." The otter twirled once, acknowledging the command, and dissolved into a streak of silver light that shot through the glass dome and into the night sky. It was done. Hermione lowered her wand. Her arm fell to her side, heavy as lead. She stood there in the silence, waiting. She should run. She should get to the apparition point at the boundary of the wards. But she couldn't move. She felt rooted to the spot, a criminal waiting for the judge. "So," a voice said from the shadows behind her. It was all a performance. Hermione stopped breathing. She didn't turn around immediately. She closed her eyes, letting the devastation of that voice wash over her. It wasn't angry. It wasn't shouting. It was dead, flat, utterly void of the warmth that had been there only hours ago. She turned slowly. Draco stood in the doorway of the secret passage. He was still wearing his trousers from the night before, but his shirt hung open, untucked. He was barefoot. He looked like he had just woken up and man walked into a nightmare. His face was a mask of marble. The vulnerability, the softness she'd seen by the fire, it was gone, erased. In its place was the terrifying aristocratic indifference of Lucius Malfoy. But his eyes were shattered glass. "Draco," she whispered. "Don't," he said. The word was soft, but it hit her like a physical slap. "Don't speak my name. You don't have the right anymore." He walked into the room, his steps silent. He didn't draw his wand. He looked at the open safe, then at her beaded bag, then at her wand still clutched in her hand. "How long?" he asked. "From the beginning? The rain? The interview?" "Yes," she admitted. There was no point in lying now. "And the conservatory? Saving my life?" "That was real," she pleaded, taking a step toward him. "Draco, please. I didn't want this. I didn't want to hurt you." "You didn't want to hurt me," he repeated, tasting the absurdity of the words. He let out a low, dry laugh that sounded like dry leaves being crushed. "You made me love you. You crawled into my bed, into my mind, into my soul, just to get the combination to a safe." "No," Hermione cried, tears spilling over. "It wasn't just for that. Last night wasn't a lie." "Last night was the distraction," he corrected, his voice hardening into ice. "Wasn't it? Keep the monster happy while you prepare the knife." "I love you," she sobbed. "I know you don't believe me, but I love you." Draco looked at her. For a second, the mask flickered. She saw the agony underneath, the raw, bleeding wound of a man who had finally opened the door only to find an assassin on the other side. "Love," he murmured, shaking his head. "You don't know what that word means. Love is not a strategy, Granger. Love is not a mission objective." He walked past her toward the window. He looked up at the sky where her Patronus had vanished. "They're coming, aren't they? The Aurors." "Yes," she whispered. "They'll be here in minutes. The wards will fall." "And you?" he asked, not looking at her. "Will you get a medal? A promotion?" "The woman who broke the Malfoy heir." "I wanted to save you," she yelled, the frustration boiling over. "The syndicate is poison, Draco. It's killing you. I wanted to get the evidence so they could take down the others, but I thought maybe I could bargain for you. I can testify. I can say you helped me." Draco turned around. His expression was one of profound pity. "You still don't understand," he said quietly. "There is no bargaining. There is no after for me. I am the syndicate. I am the head. If it falls, I fall." He reached into his pocket. Hermione flinched, raising her wand instinctively. Draco saw the movement. A flicker of pain crossed his eyes, sharp and deep. "I'm not going to curse you, Hermione," he said wearily. He pulled his hand out. He was holding a small silver ring, the Malfoy signet ring, the control for the manor's siege wards. He looked at it for a moment, then tossed it to her. She caught it reflexively. It was heavy and warm. "What is this?" "Access," he said. "The Aurors will struggle to breach the perimeter. That ring disables the outer defenses. If you want them in, use it." Hermione stared at him, stunned. "Why are you helping me?" "Because," Draco said, walking over to the piano. He ran his hand along the black wood, a gesture of farewell. "I am tired of fighting. And because, despite everything, I cannot bring myself to hurt you." He looked up at her, and the grey of his eyes was like a storm-tossed sea. "You have what you came for. Go." "Draco, come with me," she begged, stepping closer. "We can run, before the Aurors get here. We can go to the safe house. We can figure this out. Run? He raised an eyebrow. And live as what? A fugitive? A traitor to my blood and a prisoner to yours? No. He sat down at the piano bench. He looked small in the vast, empty room. Go, Granger, he commanded, his voice cracking slightly. Go be a hero. Leave the villain to his fate. I can't leave you. You already did, he whispered. The moment you opened that safe, you left me. A boom echoed in the distance. The ground shook. The wards were being hammered. The Aurors were here. Go! Draco roared, the sound tearing out of his throat, raw and terrifying. Get out, before I change my mind and burn this whole house down with us inside. Hermione flinched. She looked at him one last time. He was hunched over the keys, his head in his hands, a portrait of utter defeat. She wanted to run to him. She wanted to throw the ledger away and hold him. But she heard the shouts of the Aurors at the gates. She heard the spells hitting the stone. She had a duty. She had made a choice. I'm sorry, she whispered again, though she knew the words were worthless. She turned and ran. She ran out of the sanctuary, through the secret passage, and into the corridor. She ran past the portraits screaming alarms. She ran toward the front doors, clutching the evidence that would destroy the man she loved. Behind her, in the depths of the manor, she heard the faint, haunting sound of a piano. He was playing. He wasn't fighting. He wasn't fleeing. He was playing the same mournful, rainy melody he had played for her the night before. It was his funeral march, and she had written the score. Hermione burst through the front doors and into the cool morning air. The lawn was a chaotic battlefield of spellfire. Red robes of the Aurors swarmed the gates. "Hold fire!" she screamed, holding up the signet ring. "I have the access. I have the ledger." Kingsley Shacklebolt emerged from the crowd, his face grim. "Granger, are you intact?" "I have it," she gasped, thrusting the bag and the ring at him. "It's all there. But the target, Draco Malfoy." "We have orders to secure him," Kingsley said, taking the items. "Or neutralize if he resists." "He won't resist." Hermione grabbed Kingsley's arm. "He's surrendered. You have to promise me. No lethal force. Promise me." Kingsley looked at her, seeing the desperation in her eyes, the swollen lips, the disheveled clothes. He understood. "We will try, Hermione," he said gently. "But you know the protocol." He signaled the team. "Move in. Secure the manor." Hermione watched as 50 Aurors surged past her, storming the open doors of the home she had just fled. She stood alone on the gravel, shivering uncontrollably. The music from the piano stopped abruptly. A silence fell over the grounds, a silence louder than the thunder had been. "Draco," she whispered. She sank to her knees in the mud, covering her face with her hands, and for the first time in years, the brightest witch of her age wept not for the war, but for the victory.
I know, it's a heavy ending. I wanted to leave you here, in the rain, because sometimes the most powerful love stories aren't the ones where they ride off into the sunset. Sometimes love is a sacrifice. Throughout this story, we saw Draco willing to burn the world to keep her safe, and Hermione having to break his heart to save that same world. It's a tragedy of timing. There were the right people on the wrong sides. I like to think that maybe years later, when the wars are finally over, he is still playing that piano, and maybe, just maybe, she comes back to listen.